so excited about these 4 papers. Well, 4 we think. Right now there's 3. We might have 4 if someone else comes in. I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we'll just go down the line. I will try to keep everyone to 20 minutes, so I'll give a 2-minute warning, just so you have a
recording
sense of
in progress.
Okay, so first up will be Verónica Tozzi Thompson, who is a professor of philosophy of history at the University of Buenos Aires and epistemology of social science at the National University of Trade de Febrero, Argentina. Her main areas of interest are philosophy of history and social science, the epistemology of testimony, the politics of memory. Her main subject is to approach a narrativist philosophy of history from a pragmatic perspective of language and knowledge. Then we'll have Jakub Muchowski, who's an adjunct professor at the Department of History at, I didn't ask you to pronounce it. Do you want to say your university?
Jagiellonian University.
Perfect. My research focuses on his research focuses on the theory of historical writing, intellectual history, Holocaust and genocide studies, Polish memory cultures. He's the author of 2 books, both in Polish. I'll read the English titles: Politics of Historical Writing, 2015, and Historics of Shoah, 2006. I don't know if Márcia de Almeida Gonçalves will be here. I'll introduce her later if she arrives. And finally, we'll have Kalle Pihlainen at the University of Oulu in Finland, who works in philosophy of history and edits Rethinking History. Verónica.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Thank you, the organizers of the conference, and I couldn't be there. Well, this presentation is a summary of a research that I have been making about 3 years, and I hope to have a first preliminary version by the end of the year. Well, in his, can I share the screen? I don't know if yes,
You should be able to, yes.
Yes. Well, no, if I share the screen, I can read the page. Ahí está.
I think if you go to setup and hit individual, yep, exactly.
Okay. In his recent The Philosophical Structure of Historical Explanation, Paul Ross undertakes the task of answering a philosophical question of substantive importance. Why does narrative explain? The author warns of the undeniable fact of the widespread use of narratives to explain in all kinds of history, social, political, cultural history, history of science, and history of philosophy. The pending philosophical question is whether this habit is to be tolerated or condemned. In this work, I'm not going to focus on the notion of narrative explanation, since my interest on this occasion points to the validity of the use of narrative arguments in the public sphere. That is, not only if it is an effective and widespread strategy, an undeniable fact, but also if it is epistemically valid. Of course, if we unravel the question of the epistemic validity of narrative argumentation, we can extend it to the use of narrative argumentation to validate narrative explanations in history, Ross' subject. In fact, following Louis Mink and Paul Ross, we could see that the justification of an historical narrative explanation is also narrative. But is this an epistemic valid or a vicious circle? However, I must point out that what is not clear in these works is the notion of epistemology that will enable the validity of narrative arguments. In order to move forward on the issue, I invite you to rethink what we understand by epistemology or epistemic validity of our beliefs. If they are justified by some autonomous exercise of one's own reason or the appeal to one's own experience, or on the contrary, justification depends on social practices based on mutual trust and the social distribution of cognitive responsibility. As I hope to show below, the epistemic dimension of narrative argumentation is revealed thanks to the recent epistemology of testimony. In recent years, we have witnessed a growing concern about the spread of fake news and its power to influence social behavior in people's decisions on different issues in their daily lives, including elections and popular consultations. The term post-truth has gained popularity to precisely characterize this phenomenon, reaching an entry in the most prestigious and popular dictionaries. Oxford and Cambridge dictionaries agree on the idea that the post-truth term is introduced with the aim of denouncing the manufacture and diffusion of fake news and the strategic use of emotion, that is, the no circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than the appeal to emotion and personal belief. Thinking of the way the topic has been appearing in the mass media as well as in academia, it expresses the persistence of a consensus that the scientific method gives us access to the truth of the facts themselves without distortion or subjective emotions. The strict rational argumentation and testing against evidence is the mark of science, unlike ordinary people who depend on stories and sayings of others, experts or not, without having the rational competencies to differentiate experts from professional manipulators in the media and through digital technologies. Ordinary people are unable to distinguish a rational argument from a mere trickster story between rationality and mere manipulative rhetoric. This work's goal is dismantling the sharp opposition between rhetoric narrative and rational argumentative strategies. Narrative argumentation is an invaluable cultural asset, not only in all sorts of disputes, political, historiographical, and scientific, but also when dealing with the post-truth and fake news phenomena. What can I say about narrative argumentation? Well, I back to Paul Roth. The essential characterization of narrative explanation by Paul Roth allows us to appreciate why it generates doubts about the possibility of justifying the choice between conflicting narratives. Roth calls this problem epistemic intractability. On one hand, Arthur Danton's notion of narrative sentences provides the structure of the explanandum of narrative explanation, the sentence that describes the event or process that we want to explain. Historical events, says Roth, exist only as events under a description, and descriptions typically continue to emerge retrospectively. On the other hand, Louis Mink provides three features of narrative explanation. The non-standardization thesis critically distinguishes between historical events and those that scientific theories target for purposes of explanation. Descriptions are possible only after the event because they depend on later conceptual modes of interpretation and analysis. Therefore, Roth concludes, this implies that histories, narratives constitute the events they explain under non-standardized descriptions. From here, two theses follow immediately. The non-detachability thesis, the significant conclusions are ingredients in the argument itself, are represented by the narrative order itself, are exhibited rather than demonstrated. The non-aggregativity thesis says multiple histories cannot be coherently combined into a more comprehensive history. Given this account, the question immediately arises: how can the preference for one historical narrative over another be justified in epistemic terms? Hayden White and Hans Kellner hint at what the answers might look like. Hans Kellner suggests considering the revival of narrative from the 80s onwards in terms of a revival of rhetoric, that is, the re-emergence of the interest for problem and audience-focused argument strategies. Rhetorical approach explores those shared or communitarian conventions of writing about the past. Their eloquent recurrence and reutilization which come in handy when articulating a persuasive social discourse aimed towards concrete communities which hold concrete concerns and worries. Hayden White gives us the structure, logic, let's say, of the historical narrative argumentation and the epistemic values that are put into play. In his studies on historical realism in the 19th century, White, following Auerbach, introduces the notion of figural causality in order to appreciate how all historical representation promises to represent realistically the reality in a better way than previous representations. Our representational efforts are the renovation of past made promises by our ancestors, and our present promises will be perhaps renewed in the future. We will be the ancestors. In short, arguing historically narratively implies, on one hand, getting involved in giving answers to specific questions, and on the other, todavía no llegué, and on the other, appealing not so much to the evidence that one can collect by oneself, but rather to the voices of those who have left ask answered but relevant questions. Contextual justification and quoting trusted predecessors are the key notions of epistemology of testimony. Well, what is epistemology of testimony? Epistemology of testimony is a line of social epistemology that is due to opposition to the Cartesian ideal of the individual's epistemic autonomy and the reestablishment in Anglo-Saxon philosophy of trust, authority, and testimony as epistemic values. In a nutshell, by social epistemology, especially epistemology of testimony, I comprehend the study of the production, validation, and promotion within communitarian networks of knowledge in general and scientific knowledge in particular. This framework helps in illuminating the post-truth and fake news phenomena by means of the credibility vocabulary rather than the objective evidence manipulation of emotions opposition. Being more specific, in terms of manipulating our credit discredit attitudes. Following Benjamin McMillan, we can define second-hand or testimonial knowledge as an epistemic right of the feral. Mature epistemic agents under a standing obligation to respond to relevant epistemic challenges to what they believe are entitled to defer relevant challenge back to the original speaker. Conclusions and future research. The unprecedented pandemic situation that we have gone through in 2020 and 2021 brought to the forefront the day-to-day work of scientific research. We could see scientists working and responding to society and to government agencies for their job like perhaps we had never seen. Fundamentally, the comings and goings in COVID-19, diagnosis, recommendations on how to avoid contagion, design and dissemination of all kinds of diagrams and statistics to analyze data, and discussions about the confiability of those diagrams, statistics, and data. We could say, if there is a notion that, in wide terms, this modernist pandemic experience lives out of the game, is that of certainty. We have witnessed how, in scientific validation procedures, the appeal to evidence is an appeal to the authority of scientific institutions, legitimated by the scientific community. This social legitimation shapes a network of laboratories, institutes, publications, and government and international control agencies, which in turn legitimize each other and which establish what must be taken as evidence. This procedure could hardly be translated into the belief that each one of the individuals and scientists that make up the scientific community has individually got access to the evidence. Anyway, this narrativism epistemology of testimony alliance suggests that the exercise of narrative argumentation in the public sphere is aimed not so much at revealing the people who contrasted the evidence poorly or sending them to carry out experiments, but rather guiding them in the choice of their authorities in terms of the epistemology of testimony or their ancestors in wide terms. From this point of view, the fake news and post-truth phenomena can be seen in terms of the role that social media fulfills in building validation and dissemination closed networks belief to validate and disseminate factual beliefs. The last point I will share with you is a work of a philosopher in Guyenne that who in 2017 finds in epistemology of testimony an echo chamber escape route. An echo chamber is a social epistemic structure from which other relevant voices have been actively excluded and discredited, while simultaneously amplifying the members' epistemic credentials. Guyen proposes rewriting Descartes' narrative in the discourse of method, getting rid of his previous beliefs, trusting no one and nothing, while permitting only those beliefs of which he was entirely certain, in terms of the narrative of getting rid of credentialing beliefs. His paradigmatic example is a neo-Nazi child account of how he endured a long self-transformation process before he completely abandoned his belief system, spending years rebuilding a worldview in his own, immersing himself broadly and open-mindedly in everything he had missed, pop culture, Arabic literature, the pronouncements of the mainstream media and the youth government, rap, etc., all with an overall attitude of trust. Well, just I said, this is a work in progress, and I am trying to combine developments in narrative argumentation and the epistemology of testimony. My sources or my predecessors are John Dewey, Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, because there we could find a narrative pattern of scientific research. I will publish an article at the end of the year with this subject. And we can find in Stephen Shaping, Historian of Science, his book, A Social History of Truth, where he built a story about the experimental sciences in 17th century, in 17th century in terms of epistemology of testimony. Well, that is my work in progress. Thank you very much, and I finish.
Excuse me, can I have a presentation from this particular laptop? I think I will start. So, hello. First thing I would say is that I owe you an apology and an explanation because I did change the title of my presentation. Well, the content is not that different. I switched the notion of autonomy of history with the notion of social role of history because I realized that explaining what I mean by autonomy of history would take too much time and I would not fit into a 20-minute talk. So the title of the presentation is Social Role of History and Aesthetic Approach to Historical Writing. I will just jump into it. So most contemporary historians want to conduct studies which play an important social role. At the same time, some of them tend to consider their field as a separate sphere of activity, independent of individual human needs, group interests, and pressures of power. All of them, on the other hand, are obliged by the state and scientific institutions granting funds for research to take into account the influence of their undertakings on social reality. Historians want to change the world and are asking themselves many questions about the historiography that will be an effective tool for change. How to build an authority of history in public debate, who is the addressee of historical writing, what are historiography's proper research practices, knowledge resources, or writing forms that enable it to become an effective means of political action. However, the question that resonates most strongly in recent discussions and papers about the social role of history is what relation between historical studies and society can be established by responsible historical writing, that is, writing that recognizes and analyzes its position in the social circulation of knowledge. And this is the question I would like to focus on in my talk. Contemporary history theory has paid increasing attention to the question of social role of history. Recently, it has discussed at greater length the question of usefulness of history in the face of Earth system crisis. These exchanges are animated by Zoltan Simon and among others. In my talk today, however, I would like to return to an earlier discussion that emerged in the reaction to Hayden White's elaboration of the distinction between historical past and practical past. Both debates, by the way, share many threads and participants. To summarize White's proposal very briefly, the historical past is the systematic knowledge of the past produced by professional historians that is not used for social, political, or existential purposes, while the practical past is the set of representations of the past generally produced by non-historians that people refer to in their lives as they make sense of the present actions and make plans for the future. White's proposal was read primarily as a critique of professional historiography for its existential as well as social and political uselessness. White himself declared that he was turning his theoretical attention from now on to practical past, because it is the past that responds to existential needs of people and faces the important problems of the modern world. I've selected two commentaries from the exchanges around White's proposal that are most relevant to the question of social role of history, of historical studies. And this is the commentary by Maria Ines Lagreca and Kalle Pihlainen. I will comment on them as attempts to theorize history's engagement with debates about social and political concerns in contemporary world. And in my commentary, I will relate them to the question: what relation between historical studies and society can responsible history writing establish? So I'll start with Maria Ines Lagreca. Greca argues that the distinction between historical and practical past is inefficient in relation to feminist historiography. In this project, the search for new and more accurate knowledge of the past was closely linked to the development of new tactics of political struggle, the construction of models of individual and collective lives, and providing a better present and future against past and present oppressions. Therefore, consistent with White's notion, feminist history began as a practical past. The pessimistic tone of White's distinction directs Greca attention to the question of whether academic historiography, including the feminist project, have the energy and resources to support progressive social change. She considers two questions. First, she recognizes that feminist historiography has succeeded in including women in history, but the project involved not only supplementing history with women's history, but also transforming a discourse that constitutes itself on the exclusion of certain groups of people as unhistorical. Second, she wonders of what extent the reshaping of feminist history as an academic discipline has detached it from issues of social life and political struggle. She resolves both questions using the same argument drawn from her reading of Joan Scott. She discusses the extensive debate about abandonment of the use of a single, homogeneous and fixed concept of women's identity by feminist history. It worked well in the early stages of political struggle as a powerful unifying idea, but proved inefficient when applied to historical studies revealing diverse, complex, fluid forms of gender identity. At the time, feminist scholars were sometimes criticized by activists for the relativization of women's identities, in which they saw a symptom of academics' detachment from political reality and accused them of weakening the movement. In political action, however, the universal formula of female subject was only seemingly effective, as it excluded a number of groups, defined by race or class, for example, and did not fit within it. Feminist scholars have thus supported activists demanding the inclusion of diverse actors and intersectional forms of subjectivity. The discussion commented on, according to Greca, suggests that feminist history has developed a strong self-reflexivity that has allowed it to emerge from the conservative and theory-averse framework of academic history and to begin to establish itself as an alternative historical discourse. Furthermore, it shows that feminist historians bring critical knowledge into social circulation that can be used in political struggles, as well as to correct the workings of movement itself. Greca closes her commentary by articulating a clear and attractive statement. The humanities can support social change by providing critical reflection based on research and theoretical work. As she writes, I quote, "There is nothing in the practical past that can prevent its users from appealing to the most oppressive stereotypes or exclusionary narratives to solve his or her problem. To change the world for the better," says Greca, again I quote, "we need the destructive power of criticism and the constructive power of narrative. These are not easy to handle potentials. So we should not abandon historical profession, as White suggested, because it can still be useful to society. However, it needs further modifications, continuing the feminist project of transforming historiography from an exclusionary discourse into a space for constructing critical historical narratives for a better future." Greca's generous polemic against White's distinction is, I think, questionable in its final passages, in which she makes a statement on the social role of humanities. It is easy to see the hierarchical ordering of the relationship between scholars and society, although Greca indicates that she does not mean a, quote, "a return to the old, rightly criticized paternalistic idea of the academy as an institution offering enlightenment to the laity," end of quote. She nevertheless suggests that in political struggles, a better future can only be produced by critical references to the past provided by professional historical studies and theoretical thinking. As she points out, again a quote, "The destructive power of criticism and the constructive power of narrative, these are not easy to handle potencies," end of quote, which most likely means that they require properly trained users and should not be picked up by someone without professional training. Building an asymmetrical relation between the academy and society seems to me a misguided solution, not only because non-egalitarian future is not a better future. Equal methods of operation may also encounter the reef that all the didactic schemes clash with. These practices assume that unmasking and explaining the mechanism of social reality will produce a proper consciousness that will drive appropriate political action and a passive audience that will accurately read the educator's intentions and willingly submit to them. A project designed in this way would have to convey a clear, unambiguous, and unqualified message, while critical historical studies do not produce such a lesson. Its results tend to be ambiguous and conditional, as La Greca pointed out when she spoke of feminist scholars deconstructing gender identities. So now I switch to Kalle. Pihlainen comments on White's opposition in a different way. He declares that he does not question the distinction proposed by White, but while the American theorist turned his attention to the practical past, he, like Greca, concentrated on the historical past. However, unlike La Greca, Pihlainen argues that historiography has little relevance to political struggle or social change efforts. In short, professional historiography, in his view, is defined by its focus on representing historical facts. This task, however, is difficult to reconcile with social engagement. Representing the past in its complexity, randomness, and ambiguity essentially make it impossible to produce an appealing, coherent, articulate story of the past that could serve as a political argument about the future. Pihlainen argues that the slow and meticulous reading of sources inherent in historical writing often returning to these passages already discussed, the careful, patiently assessing reliability and considering multiple avenues of interpretation will lead the reader to believe in the clumsiness and ineffectiveness of historians. These reading experiences cannot successfully motivate audiences to act for change. Having given historiography such a diagnosis, Pihlainen goes further to argue for impotence and insularity of history. In his view, it should not be seen as a discourse that can help us answer questions about the state of our social reality or evaluate programs of political change. Representations of historical facts will not provide us with solutions to contemporary problems. The past, he adds, does not contain lessons for the present. Again, in contrast to Greca, he states that expert historical knowledge should also not serve to evaluate the articulation of the practical past. He worries that by appealing to history, for example, we might destroy a potentially progressive non-academic way of relating to the past by suggesting that factual relevance is more important than its social value. He offers, however, a different tactic for challenging harmful memory or identity narratives circulating in public, a method that avoids the direct and authoritative engagement of historiography in political struggle suggested by Greca. Namely, Pihlainen advocates that historians use a non-creative writing style in their work. He encourages a stronger exposition of sources and a reduction of narrative frame, which consists of strong narrator's voice, a clear hierarchy of narrative threads, and a clear continuous flow of the story. He also suggests constructing representations that are too complex, voluminous, and uninteresting. In Pihlainen's view, this form will be capable of modifying readers' beliefs about the possibility of obtaining certain truths, lessons, and meanings from historical narratives. It can serve to warn that any political ideas or actions based on the knowledge that historians have produced are questionable. It would also shift to readers the task of assigning meaning to historical work and making it coherent while reading. This form of writing would thus produce a more egalitarian relationship between historians and their audiences, and thus different from that projected by Greca. Although Pihlainen limits the author's control over the text and seeks to equate her with the reader, he nevertheless retains one important element of asymmetrical relationship between two actors of reading. While he argues that historians should abandon giving lessons to readers and should not provide lessons to the reader, should not provide him with catchy visions of changing the world, Pihlainen also argues for practices of presenting the past that will powerfully move the addressee and trigger reflection and action, or push him out of her, or push her out of her usual ways of perceiving reality. Such an approach assumes that the reader is passive or unaware. She will know what to do and what to think. But first, historical writing must draw her out of a passive stance and activate her. So, how else can one grasp the social role of history and answer the question of what kind of relation a responsible history should build with its audience? I myself take an approach that can be provisionally called aesthetic. Aesthetic is not understood here as a theory of art, but refers to the order of representation of things, people, actions, and thoughts. It addresses such problems as the problem of voice and voicelessness, the problem of new, the problem of responsiveness and receptivity, the problem of acknowledgement, and the problem of meaning. This approach includes such contributions as the work of Jacques Rancière, Stanley Cavell, or the work of scholars associated with the aesthetic turn in political philosophy, like Nicolas Compridis or Aleta Norval. It seems to me that this approach can be useful in answering the question of what kind of relation a responsible history should build with its audience. For this approach, historical writing is a sphere of activity that constructs historical facts and produces representations produces representations of the past. Their components are images which always refer to the world. In the process of configuration of representations, they are displaced, combined, and transformed, which results in confirming existing order of visibility or undermining and transforming it through different rules of visibility distribution. Seemingly disengaged, historiography turns out to affect and transform the social world. While I agree with Greka that the division between historical past and practical past should be challenged, I would follow a different argument. Any representation, including the representation of the past, can be emancipatory, not however in the sense that it serves as an instrument for the acquisition of power or the realization of a group interest of subordinate, but emancipation in the sense that it can produce images of egalitarian relationships between different things, groups, and people, events. It will not ascribe positions to people in society, but grant them the possibility to express themselves in any way they wish and represent reality as a heterogeneous space for disputes. Historical representation may also be conservative and expose historical relations between different things, groups, and people and events, and assign people positions in society and link them to specific forms of expression, and present reality as a harmonious space or one devoid of tensions and conflicts. Historiography seems to have a political potential. It can reconfigure the visibility of things, people, and events, divide and combine places, resources, modes of expression, and make different forms of collective life conceivable. Greka attributes to history the ability to change social reality through critical instruments that expose and explain its mechanisms. This approach, however, seems undemocratic as it uses categories of a surface known to all and a depth accessible to a few, and a proper and false consciousness. Finally, Pihlainen, while using the notions of history impotence and insularity, acknowledges its weak but important ability to intervene in public debates by challenging attempts to use the past for political action. Greka and Pihlainen respond differently to the question of who is the producer of historical discourse and what relationship between historical studies and society such discourse can establish. In Greka's view, it should be produced and controlled by historians trained in the academy, although, as I mentioned above, Greka recognizes the important contribution of individuals and groups outside the academy. According to Pihlainen, historians are usually and should remain accompanied in the production of historical representations by readers who, in the course of reading historical works, supplement them, make them more coherent, give them meaning, and draw conclusions. However, Pihlainen also sees the reader as a passive actor who needs to be stimulated to take an active part in the reading process. It seems to me that the author can leave the text undetermined and relinquish control over the reading process in order to allow the reader to participate in its co-creation. The opposition between active and passive reader, on the other hand, I think it's misguided because the reader always remains active, just as the author does. She reads, organizes the incoming data, and interprets the text. What means of producing historical writing might serve to build egalitarian relations between the historian and her audience? One of them might be to establish a reading contract with the audience of historical work. In every textual communication, including historical writing, there is a reading contract which suggests how it can be read and at the same time assigns certain positions to the author and the reader. The content of the pact may be signaled by non-textual practices and elements of the historical text. Although historical theory has focused for many years on historical writing as textual communication, it has paid little attention to the issue of the reader and the reception of historiography. This problem has been discussed most extensively in recent years by already mentioned Pihlainen, as well as Pia Albeck.
This is maybe like a 2-minute warning.
Okay, so conclusion. What might a theory of history Where might theory of history look for answers to the question posed by the beginning of this talk about the relationship between historians and their audiences? The search for new forms of writing to enhance the political potential of historiography seems an unnecessary and risky undertaking. Historiography already seems to have the means and the means at disposal to intervene in the public sphere. Efforts to increase the effectiveness, which consists in constructing a representation of the past, so that the historian has stronger control over the reception of the representation, fall into the didactic logic which, with its asymmetrical relation to author and reader. Rather, the correct course of action is to look for historiographical forms that offer readers a reception contract, establishing equality between historian and her audience. Such texts have open-ended endings and do not provide explicit explanations of reality and lessons for the future, but leave it to the readers to make meanings of the representation and to draw lessons from the past. Further studies could therefore focus on analyzing the pacts historians make in their works and the ways in which they articulate them. They would allow us to come closer to answering the question of what kind of relationship between historical research and society a responsible historical discourse can establish. Thank you.
You surprised me. Please cut me off if I go on too long. I'm not sure what I want to do at the end of the paper, so we'll find out together. I have to apologize, I'm having some problem with my eyes, so I'll probably, if I'm reading, I'll go slowly. Just a little bit clumsy right now. Yeah, let me just open my notes for a second. Okay, fortunately it opened at least. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little digression, confessional, but relating to this paper, because I wrote the abstract, as most of you did, a long time ago. And I had a very well-structured, well-prepared abstract in my sort of own sense of it, and well argued, and very concise, and I thought that would be easy to talk for 20 minutes about. And yeah, I didn't finish it in that 2 years, or whatever, in advance, so here we are. But the point is that the confessional part is that when I started actually thinking about the topic now, I realized I can't just sit and explain it to you because there are a couple of threads which I started tugging at which bothered me, and then I realized that I won't be able to do what I promised in the abstract, and instead I will sort of tell you about the process, what my intentions were and what sort of started troubling me and what I started tugging at these two threads, and I'll try and explain that instead. Let me just check. Yeah, I think the most important point about noticing these several problems in my own thinking was that I also think it's something that we as a profession, as a sort of fairly coherent small field, we all easily fall prey to, so that's why I want to illustrate these things too as well. Excuse me. So, the very first thing, the title of my paper, I don't know if it's visible anywhere, since I didn't prepare the slides, I assume it's in the program, was Insistence and the Fringes of Historical Writing. And this is an idea I think many of you probably recognize from Roland Barthes in mythologies, the idea of the insistent fringe. If you don't know it, it's a very short essay where he just talks about Hollywood movies, about Romans, and how they all have a short haircut. The insistent fringe here, and it's you always know as a viewer that this is a Roman, and also he points out in passing that this is why you have no bald Romans in Hollywood films, because it's not possible to identify them as Romans, which is a side issue there. Anyway, its purpose is to make us sort of immediately read in that correct context, or view in that context, and also to establish some credibility about what's going on. Thank you. I'm hearing myself so much, I thought I was sort of too loud. Okay, so it gives us comfort. We know what we're viewing, and it establishes credibility. And there was a very brilliant paper by Vivian Sobchak in History and Theory in 1997, where she takes up Barth's idea and analyzes it and sort of puts her own twist on it in a very sophisticated way, questioning a lot of what Barth does in this very short essay. I won't go into the details of that, but it's worth knowing about. The example Sobchak gives is about the Middle Ages and the idea that we always need some idea of dirtiness or squalor or something like that, which will be an iconic sort of representation that we know we're dealing with the Middle Ages, and also in writing, not necessarily only in visual media, but she doesn't develop the writing part very much further. But you'll recognize these are both forms of metonymy. So they both establish a contiguity between what's going on or what the sort of fringes and what is sort of the whole that it's referring to. Now, metonymy works part or part whole, as you know, but squalor and the insistent fringe both would be metonyms for this larger whole in these instances. And that's where, when I started thinking about this, the first thread, which started bothering me, appeared. And my question was, what happens when I start pulling at this? And that ended up leading me to doing too much reading, which I wasn't prepared for time-wise. So the first point, I think, that came to me in this, I shall collect my thoughts in the meantime. I love that last one. That was good. Okay, so to me it suggested several things. One thing it suggested to me was that in our discussions in the field of theory and philosophy of history, we mostly have missed the kind of sophistication that Sobchak does in that essay, and we don't have that kind of theoretical work much at all. And the second point, that this tiny example of just the insistent fringe is the sort of top of a huge iceberg, I think, which has, when I got into the reading, there's so much to read on this issue that I just despaired at the point. I'll describe some of the points to you toward the end if I have time. The worrying thing to me was that essay has gone pretty much completely remarked, and it's one of the best essays in our field, which I find very strange. And then now we're at the point where we say we don't need to talk about representation anymore because it's a straightforward thing. And I think the problem with Barth's idea of insistent fringe is that it's a visual image, so it makes it very easy to forget, the medium itself, which is why it's great to have this kind of conference, of course, as well. And we tend to fall for that simple appearance and just forget about the fact that there's something more complicated going on. So we have a detail of the past, and we just assume that that will give us access to the past. And what we end up doing, I think, almost all of the time, even in our sort of field which is focused on that, is we forget about mediation most of the time. Or at least we don't investigate the specific strategies and specific practices which are involved in that very much at all. Yeah, with either dirt or squalor, or the insistent fringe, it's not calling us to pay much attention to what's going on in these representational practices. And so the thing I initially wanted to do in the paper, reviewing my abstract now, was to just look at the idea of insistent fringe, and I fell in exactly that same perception, that I wasn't thinking about what's specifically going on in a complex way. So I thought I'd look at the idea of insistent fringe, explain why it's important to pay attention to it as an example of a broader phenomenon, maybe something that we could translate, look at it also happening in writing, and other representational forms, and also in relation to how it functions in relation to other representational strategies, so we'd have a better understanding of the different things going on in history writing through looking at some of these things. And also I wanted to give some evidence that it correlates with something that's currently being ignored in a lot of the fashionable debates in theory and philosophy of history. And also try to say why it's been ignored, not just that it has been ignored. And there was a final point I wanted to elaborate it to convince you all that it's not a visual phenomenon alone, but that we have similar insistences in history writing and in language and linguistic representation in general. And I was planning to give you some examples and so on, but that got very complicated. So I couldn't produce that paper, but I will tell you about the problems. An important thesis that I had sort of going into that was that this fringe is not only a cute idea in that one context and one medium of Hollywood film, but that's something that needs to be recognized as a very general representational problem and strategy. And the reason why I couldn't carry this through, why this didn't work the way I planned, was it's just not so simple, obviously, now that I've started thinking about it. And it's also because there was a second thread that I started pulling on, which bothered me a lot. And my motive in relation to that other thing was that the fringe, the insistent fringe, it offers a useful example of how little attention has been given to these more sophisticated theorizations of representation, even in, or perhaps particularly in our field of theory and philosophy of history. And it really bothers me at the moment that we are becoming pundits rather than thinking about what we're doing. I think a lot. Anyway, maybe it's just me. I don't want to project that onto anyone else. But anyway, I started pulling up these things. The second one also started to unravel because I wanted to understand why we don't tackle this kind of more complex theory very much at all in our discussions. But I'll go back to the first thread for a little while and try and explain what went wrong in my thinking there. So when we tried to bring this idea of insistent fringe directly to bear on language and to history, that is to history writing, there's immediately two obvious kinds of metonymic forms that it could take, but already different to the basic idea of insistent fringe. First one, we could just follow Nietzsche in the idea, maybe also Henri Bergson, and say that this happens to pretty much every case of language use. Then this is an argument from Nietzsche via Derrida, Ethan will probably know. Derrida claims that Nietzsche's argument is that we transport into time the speech, into the time of the speech that which is itself is heterogeneous to this time. So when we use something, we already bring something outside that time and place. And in that sense, it's a metonymy, which basically means everything, every expression pretty much, is metonymous. So we don't necessarily want to go down that road, but there's already one objection or one way of thinking what would happen in language if we tried to apply that idea of the insistent fringe. Number two, in Proust, there's a classic citation where he just gives the example of how you see someone rushing out of a church dressed in black, as you always do in these kinds of situations. So this kind of iconic image, which always happens in situations of these small villages with churches and people sort of dressed in black and going back and forth on this. But anyway, so this would be another way of looking at it, having this kind of again, a metonymy between that person and then this village and how things are in that kind of setting, a certain kind of rural setting. Or in historical writing, I was trying to think of examples, and that's where it becomes really hard. So far, I've only sort of thought of a few examples. I'll give you one very trivial one. This is the idea of bankers jumping out of windows in 1929. At this point, when you sort of come up, when you sort of evoke that, then you already know the context and so on. So this kind of thing we do all the time, obviously. So importantly is neither one of those options, either using language as a general metonymic or saying everything in language is metonymy or saying that we have these kinds of examples, they don't work in the same way as Barth's idea of the insistent fringe does. And it kind of bothered me why, and I had to start thinking about it more and reading more, and the answer pretty much is that because in history writing or writing in general, the closest thing we'd come to the insistent fringe would be to use the word Roman. And this is where it gets pretty annoying if you try and carry out from this idea that we can do the same thing in language, and then you use the noun Roman, because that introduces to us everything we already know. So it's in a metonymous relation to what we know about Romans. Or maybe easier to understand with stereotypes for national characteristics. That's even clearer. We use these kinds of stereotypes all the time with different nationalities. So it's a similar kind of shorthand, but it works in the other direction. Already when we're bringing something to language from visual representation, when we try and apply it, we're actually working in a reverse direction. And when Derrida speaks of Nietzsche about this, he goes also back to Dumarsais, and Dumarsais in the 60s has this idea of the metonymy of the sign, so that the sign itself becomes the direct quote is something like, to take the sign for the thing signified, and it's a bit technical. If we have time, we can try and go into that in the discussion, or if I have time, I'll go to it at the end. But the basic idea to pick from that is that if we try and apply the idea of insistent fringe directly to writing, we'd have the word Roman, which would then introduce us to the world of what it means to be a Roman to us based on our knowledge of history. So both things are only at the level of the signified. And then we get to ask the question, where is that knowledge about what is this to be Roman? Where is it? How does this work if we all have different contents to that knowledge? And when I was sort of pulling on this thread, think about it more, the harder and harder it gets of course, to actually locate that knowledge, because it's not a specific set of knowledge. It can vary between any of us and so on. So that's that one thread I'm sort of gradually unraveling, and then I wanted to pull on the second one a little bit too, and I'll explain what's going on there. It doesn't seem to me completely unfair to say that most of the time when talking about history, we can't be bothered to get into these technical discussions about representation. Instead, we just try to reduce very often the discussion to the idea of reference to concrete reality, and we do that on a fairly simplistic level, and it ultimately fails, and I'll return to the reasons why of that as well, if I have time. So in trying to avoid those problems, we focus a lot on problems of representation. We tend to focus a lot on questions like uses of the past, historicity, historical periods, historical time, even speculative philosophy of history, or we turn to currently what I see as currently trending things. Might be wrong, but from the point of view of what I've been reading, some things might be to focus on experience of the past and the present, or to focus on what kind of rational arguments we can make about the past or about historical processes, or to focus on how the past places us in relation to the future, for example, or just simply present our own readings and contextualizations of various phenomena. And that's where pulling that second thread really began to bother me more and more. Things were starting to unravel, because I don't get it, how we can properly discuss any of these ideas if we choose to ignore how we talk about the past, how we present, how we construct, how we understand, choose whatever word you want to use for that. But if we don't talk about how it's being done, then how can we talk about these other things which are telling us, or where we have to engage with the past that is somehow already there? And for me, the question, of course, is why should we ignore these more interesting things as well, and talk about something where the past is taken for granted, the representation itself. So what bothers me on that second side of things is that with all the sophisticated tools and thinking that we seem to have as a field, yet we still presume somehow to say that representation isn't important or an interesting issue anymore. And of course, because that's what I'm working on, it really troubles me that no one cares, basically. So I'm very happy about this panel where we're talking about this stuff. I thought one way to think about why it's going on is to follow Michel de Certeau. I think that history is a matter of killing the past to present the new. I really like that in de Certeau. And as he tells us, even when we're trying to kill that past, we have these resistances, we get reminders, and we can never sort of completely get away from it. It always comes back in some way. Also, Ethan's ontology, of course. This discussion is very parallel to that one. And on top of that, of these reminders, things returning, so on, there's also just plain facticity. We have the material things which also resist these descriptions, so it's always easier. And also we have events, we have statements, we have facts, so we have a ton of stuff, and we don't really have to worry about the colligation, that comes later. And killing the past in this instance happens by not wanting to recognize, in my understanding, by not wanting to recognize all these various insistences, resistances, and so on, which are present. So we want to get rid of those. And we can only write an unproblematic history referring to the past once that resistance stops, once we've actually managed to kill that past. Now, I don't think for present purposes, and I don't know how much time I have either, but, sorry, two? Okay, thanks. I'll try not to go on too long anyway. I don't think it's important how we theorize these different insistences. There's a lot of ways of doing it. There's tremendous literature. If there's time, I can think of, or just list basically some names. But the more important thing is that we populate representation with these things, different kinds of metonymic relations, metaphors, different kinds of, well, I just already said what kind of things they are, so I won't repeat that. And we can't represent or construct anything without having a massive variety of these different kind of elements that we're using on hand. And on a general level, just to go over perhaps very quickly, they can be sort of markers of genre. So what, after Barth, when he talks about signs of literature, we could call signs of history if we tried to identify that kind of thing. They can be just reality effect markers also from Barthes, or fictional truth creation from Michael Rifferter, or just the basic facts, material resistance, whatever. But the important thing is that in any representation, we can go back to Aristotle, or only recently to colligation or something, but if we go back to Aristotle, mostly through recur, I think we can say that it's a matter of grasping things together. So there's a huge amount of stuff that we're trying to grasp together. And what's very important to understand there is that it's not a finished product. It's not something we've killed. In Aristotle, it's not like we sort of, when we talk about Aristotle representation, we say, okay, there's a beginning, middle, end, and this is sort of a thing we're looking at, a finished thing, but he's talking about it being an action of representation and not a finished product. And it's, I think also, it's not to worry, I get to think again. It sounds like it, yeah. I love that last one. So oh, no. Beautiful. So yeah, what's important to understand is that it's not a finished product. It's not something we've killed. And also to accept that we're really unable to kill it, and we're being intellectually dishonest if we're trying to ignore all that complexity and present it as something done over and something we can just deal with and represent unproblematically. So in Aristotle, if we accept the idea that we're trying to grasp a lot of things together, so take the example of the bankers jumping out of a window again. We take that as a fact. Apparently it's a false fact when you're reading these histories, but anyway, it's something iconic like that. To understand better what's going on, we still have to take a step back and look at it and think that when we have this kind of insistence, whatever you call it, a fact, a factoid, or a fake fact in this case perhaps, we take it as a metaphor, and we take it precisely as a metonym for the overall colligatory concept of the Great Depression, or whatever we sort of take it personally as referring to. And the things I wanted to talk about as examples, I mean, we have a huge literature starting with Alison Landsberg, who's speaking, I think, tomorrow, with this idea of prosthetic memories. Ilkka Lähteenmäki, who's here, he has this idea of self-contained historical worlds, that they are actually self-contained, so we can think about it on that level, of broader constructs. And even though they are those kinds of broad theoretical constructs, most of the time we're referring to them, we mostly appeal to them in these same metonymic ways. So we're just using it to give a general idea. And then you have films, Killing Fields, King's Speech, you look at the titles, they're already sort of metaphors in themselves. History books, same thing, Sleepwalkers, King's Two Bodies, so we can sort of have these different kinds. And you can come down this list to dates, names, basically you say 1776, which is a topical one, of course, 1789, 1848, people already have that same association. So when we're building this stuff, we can go down to that level, we can go down to the very basic level of just truisms and so on. I think I'm over time, right? Yeah. So I will not go further, but if we want to discuss this, I would be happy to discuss. And it's very much a work in process, and I'm trying to formulate this through this idea, firstly through the idea of resistance, so we have Barth and de Soto, but then also this idea of affordances, and at the same time that they're things which limit us. They also afford a lot of things we can do. And yeah, as I said, there's too much reading for me right now to actually get a proper handle of that, but this is what I'm trying to do, or instead of having done the paper, which I intended to do. So there we go. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all for 3 fascinating papers, and we have 15 minutes to discuss. So does anyone have any questions? Over here.
Yeah, I have a comment on Kalle's paper. Well, it's an attempt to summarize it in about 2 sentences. Okay. And I wonder whether you would agree with the summary or whether you have any thoughts on the summary.
I would be grateful for a summary.
Yeah, I think you were saying, what you're saying is this. Historical writing always has to assume many things as being true. That neither the historian nor the historian's audience can know to be true, or at any rate that the historian cannot spend the time to show to be true. And so accordingly, you are arguing that historiography, history, is a systematically ungrounded discourse. To what extent would you accept that attempt to give a kind of more theoretical account of what you are saying with respect to the Roman fringe?
That was, you put it in such different terms, I really have to think about it. For me, the question of truth doesn't really enter, because I do think it's grounded to a great extent. I think we can agree that we have these. Historians do good research, in my opinion, so we can point to a lot of singular statements and so on.
So I would sort of respond to that in saying that, of course, historians do show many things. Historians do show that many things are true.
Yeah.
But the fact is, if we tried to show that everything that we assume in our account, that we have in our account is true, we wouldn't get past the first page.
Yes, in that sense I agree. I'd pass that question to Veronica, who made the point about validity instead of truth in this context, because I think that's an important point. So I still wouldn't speak of truth. I'd say we can have sort of extended representations which can be valid, and then assessed on a social basis, as Veronica was arguing. So, yeah.
Somebody on screen? Or?
No.
Thank you for all your presentations. This one will be to Jakub, because you said that it seems that the correct course of actions is to look for historiographical forms that offer readers a reception contract establishing equality between historian and audience. And I was wondering whether do you already see such new forms of historiographical writing arising, or do you maybe see examples of this way of writing? Because I agree with your argument, but I was just trying to find myself such new forms, and it was a bit difficult for me to present how we can achieve this goal, this aim. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm not sure what you actually mean right now. You're asking about the forms of this contract with the reader, or?
Yes, how we can create this contract, and what, because you said there is a historiographical form, so I understood it's forms of historiographical writing, and I was wondering, it's still like an article, a book, or do you see a new form, or old forms that should be made in a new way that has this contract in them?
I have two ways of answering that. First is that I did not went into putting my observations into practice and look for these articulations of the contract with the reader that would be the one that I expect them to be. And the second answer is that one can follow Kalle's argument that historians already are doing this kind of things, the regular historians, the one that are writing these voluminous, incoherent books, and in there probably we could find this kind of pact with the reader. Yes, this is the way I understand what you were saying in your article, that we don't really need these new forms of historiography, or maybe we need them, but first we have to think maybe about the forms that we already have, whether they are good enough, and check whether the contracts that they are built by regular historians, let's say, are the one expected. I'm not sure this is the case with the writing, but I would follow Kalle's intuition.
So, well, thank you all, first off. But so I have a question for Kalle, which I guess is following on Alan's, where the thing I'd like to press you on is, so we have a sense of what you think short-circuited with your initial project and the threads you want to pull. And I'm trying to maybe get you to articulate what you see the end goal or accomplishment. I mean, it sounds like a rescue mission for representation in a way. One could see why. I mean, as you say, there seems to, on your account, there seems to be little work done on a crucial question. So I am interested in hearing about sort of, I mean, is this a response to the post-narrative moment? Is the post-narrative argument an anti-representational argument on your account? Is there something, is it just that theorists of history and historians have taken their eye off this question in some ways because it is too hard and too stabilizing? Or is there something else going on at this particular moment, and maybe this speaks to Veronica's paper, that we're at a kind of post-truth moment, a moment in the waning power or the waning epistemological power of the expert, and that there is some pressing need to return to this question to articulate, either recouping from the past or something new, a means of providing history and people who think about the past with the vocabulary to, I mean, now I'm editorializing, to take up this particular moment. So I'm really interested in sort of the motivating factors here and what you think this can achieve. You know, one wouldn't assume you'll solve all the threads, but in even making them explicit to us. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure it would change anything very much. It's my personal sort of pet peeve at the moment. I think that we've had this turn to presence and experience for so long, which has been fiercely anti-theoretical already, and now this discussion of post-narrativism in some parts, I find it, it seems to me the argument is that if we say narrative is sort of this fairly simple construction, as we teach Aristotle to students, instead of the way Aristotle presents what narrative is, then we can say that, okay, most history works aren't narratives because they're much more complicated than a straightforward sort of chronological causally linked narrative, and neither one of those is necessary even for Aristotle, but he also allows that it's a process, which also leaves a lot of room for the reader again, which is why I was really thankful that Jakub was thinking about the reader, because also when you take Aristotle seriously, then this explanation by implotment, you can leave that up to the reader as well. It's a process of understanding things and grasping together, as they say, as Ricoeur also reiterates in Aristotle, or of Aristotle. So I think there's just, I think I'm just annoyed that we're dismissing things, as I have been for a few years, that we're dismissing things as not functioning when it seems to me that we haven't really tackled them. So that's basically it. It's not, I'm not sure if it's a response to what's going on broadly or if it's just a response to what I've been reading. Obviously, I'm looking at it from a very narrow perspective. So it's hard to say, but anyway, my pet peeve at the moment, I think.
I actually have a question that sort of follows from that. I was trying to think your two papers together and think about the relationship between metonymy and visibility. So if historical representations bring things, make them visible so that the reader can work on them, it strikes me as the work of metonymy, the word Roman or the fringes, like activates all of the things that were visible in our head, and then the author can do something with them. So I just wanted to invite you to sort of respond to each other's way of thinking about representation and the reader, if you want to.
That's very hard. I'm still stuck on working through the sort of technical aspects of metonymy. The idea from de Moray, I think, is that basically what happens. So it is building on Nietzsche's idea, but basically what happens is that I'm not sure if I explained it properly, so I'll try and say it very quickly again. Is that we have the word, say the word Roman, am I going to be able to articulate this? Okay, let's leave that part of the equation alone. But what it does, what it signifies, whether it's a signifier or a signified, this is a different question. But what it signifies then is not actually a signified, but another signifier which takes the place of the signified. So basically, we are just awakening, as you said in your question, awakening things that a reader has in their heads. And yeah, in that sense, I think it would be really interesting to look more at what readers do and what kind of worlds and where they get their influences, and because it's not only academic history, which is what I'm really glad that Kuba mentioned this paper that you brought to my mind, my paper previously, where my concern is that it's not only academic history. I mean, academic history is a very small part of how we sort of form our understanding of the past, whether you call it history or not. So then where all this comes from, I would love to hear someone tell me this.
Thank you for the question. I'm rather surprised with this link, and I really don't know how to connect it. Sorry.
It's incredibly hard.
Other questions? Anyone online? You can raise your hand. Yeah, Piotr.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually inspired by the last attempt to link that to, and I think maybe the link, and I don't know, I would happy to hear, is that in Barthes' way, the author is the creator of the fringe, but because of the reader. So it's always like the interplay between the two, rather than a clear cut who makes this signification, who sign to things, because we sign. I make my sign pointing to something because I expect someone to see where I'm pointing, and it would be, for example, pointless to point on certain things to my dog, and very correct to point to them, let's say some colors, right, to other people. So maybe in a way, this notion of fringes activates the reader and gives him some active part within the representation, and maybe this is also something that is missing in our discussions of representation, and I agree that it touches the whole point of representation, which is also referring to the social role of it as such. So yeah, this would be a great way to reinvigorate the discussion, and I think it is right. But the question which I would like to ask directly, Kalle, is what is the main difference between the visual fringe that is in the beginning of your thought process and the linguistic one, as you say, that is much more complex and difficult to tackle? But what makes it actually that much of a difference if we're talking about the theory of signs? Why the linguistic sign is such more different than the visual one? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think the very basic thing is that we can't reproduce that kind of sign in language. So I was trying to illustrate it with, I spent a lot of time trying to think what the insistent fringe of the Roman or the Hollywood films would be, and I think in language it would be, and this is what Ricoeur, de Soto, everyone seems to arrive at, also Sobchak in the article, in part, is that basically it's just a noun which designates, for most of us, that thing that we want to refer to. So it's very much an anticlimax on that level in language. But then it opens the way to looking at all these other different kinds of insistences which we have, sort of described images, events, so on, and it says positions, facts, and everything else in a different position as well. I think, when we start to look at them together, assuming they all operate in parallel fashions at least. But to find something similar in language, it seems to be that, I mean, that was part of my initial idea, that I want to do this, and then I realized there's no way to do it. And then fortunately, so many of these authors that I've been reading have also said that it's not what language does, basically. So we have proper nouns for a reason, and they are our sort of insistences most of the time. And then we create more, of course, through discourse. So more complicated constructs as well.
Our time is almost up, but we do have time if maybe one more question. Does anyone have a question about Veronica's work? Well, I can ask a version of the question. I wonder, Veronica, if you want to talk about like the reader of history in relation to the concerns that you were bringing up for us, since that seems to be a through line, the epistemic work of the reader.
Sorry, could you speak louder, please, because I couldn't hear.
Yeah, sorry. I just wondered, to kind of bring some of the concerns of the panel together, if you all wanted to think about some of your concerns about epistemic validity in relation to the experience of reading the historical text.
Well, I don't know if it's my subject, but I think the experience of reading any text, always we read with a background, no? You never read a text, a historical text, comparing with the reality of the past itself. You always read a text comparing with other texts. So this point, I think the epistemic of testimony and narrative philosophy of history is they are two approaches that consider the reception of the reading is part of the meaning of the text, because the text doesn't meaning without a reading. So I don't know if I answer your question, but I think it will be my point.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and let's thank all of the panelists for a really stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
The end.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on this difficult question.
It was a lovely question. It was very difficult.
Do you know